You're good, Tom.
You want to turn my video off, Aaron?
You can if you
'Cause
want.
I don't have any roles, so no use having another box.
Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Marciano, president of the New York State Wireless Association. We've got another great webinar for you today. So fantastic panelists. This is our third in a series that we plan on continuing. And we've put this together, of course, with the New Jersey Wireless Association, who we work very, very closely with. And today you see the panelists up there. And in a moment, I'm going to hand this off to Dominic Valecco, who is the newly elected president of the New Jersey Wireless Association. On behalf of NYSWA, I wanted to thank our sponsor for this event, which is the Amato Law Firm. And again, without all of our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to put this together. So it's greatly appreciated. If you can just sit tight for another minute or so, we're going to wait for more people to log on, and we'll be right back with you. Thanks very much.
All right, Dominic, I think we can go ahead.
All right. Tom, thank you for that introduction, and looking forward to working with New York State Wireless, NYSWA. As you mentioned, we work very closely, got two great organizations. We really enjoy working with NYSWA, and we've put on this great series of webinars. Again, looking forward to working with you and your organization. Some notes before we start. You'll notice, for those of you that are watching today, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom control panel, there is a Q&A section. If you can click on the Q&A if you have any questions, we'll be fielding questions that way. And today's presentations will be mailed to all attendees. And we're also looking to put these on our respective web pages, NYSWA.org and NewJerseyWireless.org. So if you'd like more information, please visit those websites, and we will do that. Good morning, everyone. And if you go to the next page, please. There we go. Today, we've got some highly respected panelists: Arturo Chang, Senior Counsel, Government Affairs from WIA; Beth Cooley, she's Assistant VP of State Legislative Affairs for the CTIA; and D. O'Roark, he's the Managing Associate General Counsel and State Government Affairs for Verizon. They're going to detail the bills that are pending in our legislatures today in both New Jersey and New York, and talk a little bit about what's going on and how these will impact future deployment of 5G. I'm sorry about that. The NYSWA sponsor for this event was the Amato Law Firm. And the New Jersey, I'd like to thank the New Jersey Wireless annual sponsors. We've got over 40 annual sponsors. Each year we grow our sponsorship base, and without your support, we would not be able to do these events and the other events that we've planned throughout the year and into next year. So again, thank you to all of our annual sponsors for your continuing support. You've really been a great help for us to do all of our work. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Beth Cooley from CTIA. Thank you, Beth.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you to both the New Jersey and New York State Wireless Associations for having me this morning speak on this exciting topic of 5G. And before we dive into the discussion about the New Jersey and New York small cell legislation, I thought it best to sort of level set on where is wireless today in both New York and New Jersey. Before jumping into that, just a quick snapshot of who is CTIA. We are the wireless carriers, the handset manufacturers, and many of their suppliers. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I thought it was best to level set on the prevalence of wireless in both New York and New Jersey. The people in both of these states continue to demand at increasing levels access to both wireless products and services. And this is demonstrated by the fact that there are far more wireless devices than there are people in both of these states. As you can see from the stats in New York, we're also talking about significant job contribution. Over 193,000 jobs are supported by the wireless industry in New York. Next slide, please. And the same can be said for New Jersey. Again, more wireless subscriber connections than there are people, and over 111,000 jobs, as well as 11.1 billion with a B, contributed to New Jersey's GDP from the wireless industry. Next slide, please. So given the number of wireless subscriber connections, and yes, you can still make a phone call with your device, as we're all finding in this uncertain time of COVID, it should come as no surprise that demand for mobile data continues to skyrocket. As CTIA does our annual survey every year, these results are from the most recent survey. In 2019, 96 times more mobile data was used than in 2010 at 37.06 trillion megabytes. So what does that look like? To put that into perspective, this amount of trillion of megabytes is the equivalent to the entire population of Chicago watching The Last Dance over 1,600 times each. So that is a lot of data. So with this explosive data growth, which is clearly occurring on wireless networks today, where are we going and how do we accommodate this demand on our networks? How do we ready our networks for the future? Next slide, please. So enter 5G. 5G, 5th generation, will be 5 times as responsive as today's 4G networks. This means that the latency, or the time between data sending and receipt, will be reduced by 5 times, which makes it especially well suited for mission critical communications in areas like telemedicine, public safety, and first response. 5G will also serve up to 100 times more devices than today's 4G networks, which means that IoT, or Internet of Things, can connect a vast array of previously unconnected objects, from streetlights and trash cans to parking meters and crops. And finally, 5G will be 100 times faster, which is often the sexy talking point that we hear about, which makes it a great backbone for bandwidth intensive technologies like AR, VR, and high resolution images and videos. Next slide, please. 5G is also an exciting economic development time. According to Accenture, 5G over the next 7 years will create 3 million new jobs nationally, contribute 500 billion to the US GDP. Wireless providers will invest $275 billion of their own money, not taxpayer dollars, and will create $160 billion in smart city benefits and savings. Next slide, please. Now, within this data developed by Accenture, they do have a formula where Accenture, can estimate the number of jobs, network investment, and GDP growth by city. So I just pulled a couple of cities from both New York and New Jersey. In New York City, over 78,000 jobs are estimated to be created. And in Jersey City, New Jersey, nearly 2,500 jobs. Given the uncertain economic times that we're in, 5G is truly fueling economic development across the country. Next slide, please. 5G will also be connecting everything. I'm just going to highlight a few silos. Arturo from WIA will also highlight some 5G benefits as well. But I would just note that truly the benefits of 5G are only limited by our imaginations. Just a couple of silos, as I mentioned, I wanted to highlight public safety. Improvements made to wireless connectivity can actually save lives and reduce crime. Deloitte found that a 60-second improvement in emergency response time translates to a reduction of 8% in mortality. Further, a California fire chief testified that a fire doubles in size every 60 seconds. So imagine what that 60-second improvement in response time can save. One other area, healthcare. I don't know about folks who are turning in or my other panelists, but I personally have had numerous telehealth check-ins with my doctors throughout this pandemic. 5G technology will further enhance these services through remote patient monitoring and even remote surgery through connected healthcare devices. Next slide, please. So today, we estimate that approximately 200 million Americans are covered by 5G. And this is a testament to communities and states and the industry wireless providers working together to find solutions to facilitate the build out of wireless infrastructure. And speaking of infrastructure, I just wanted to take a minute to discuss what this wireless infrastructure looks like and what it actually is. Next slide, please. I think many of the folks tuning in are familiar with this infrastructure, so I won't spend too much time on this, but in order to provide 5G, we need the proper wireless infrastructure in place. And the infrastructure that will provide 5G is dependent on the type of spectrum that is being used and the provider's needs. So small cells are often synonymous with 5G. And 5G, however, will also be provided by other infrastructure, like those macro towers that you see along the side of the highway. But how do we get there and how do we achieve these benefits? Next slide, please. Enter small cells. Just an additional point, while small cells are often synonymous with 5G, small cells are being deployed today to accommodate that network demand through mobile data usage on our networks. So yes, they're important for 5G, but it's also important to highlight the need for a regulatory framework so we can deploy these small cells today to accommodate explosive demand on wireless networks. Next slide, please. The next couple slides I have are just some examples of small cells. Again, I know many of you are probably familiar with this. A few different types of small cells models are out there, and I suspect they will continue to change as the technology changes. But we're talking about an antenna on the top and a radio head box on the side of an existing structure in these slides. Next slide, please. And in these examples, again, we're looking some at traffic lights, and there is a standalone small cell. You might be able to see the brown standalone small cell, which can be constructed when we don't have something to attach to. This is purposely somewhat difficult to see because it blends in with the environment. This is actually in Washington, D.C. And you can see that the antenna and the equipment are all enclosed into one pole. So this is another option or visual aesthetic, if you will, on small cells. So next slide, please. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dee O'Roark with Verizon. Dee's going to provide you all with an overview on what's been happening nationally on small cell legislation, as he's been involved over many years in many states, and talk a little bit about the New York and New Jersey small cell legislation as well. Dee?
Thanks, Beth. And thanks everyone for having me here today. As mentioned before, I'm a managing associate general counsel for Verizon with regulatory and legislative responsibility for several states. I started working on small cells almost 5 years ago in late 2015. I've been Verizon's lead counsel on 15 of the small cell bills that have become law. So back in 2015, Verizon was attempting to deploy small cells to densify our 4G network, something that Beth just referred to, and something that we're still doing, by the way. But in 2015, we were running into lots of problems. In most states, wireless carriers did not have a statutory right to access the right-of-way or government poles. and we were having trouble negotiating access rights with cities. And even when we had access, it was easy to get bogged down in the application process. Sometimes we even faced moratoria when cities stopped processing our applications altogether. And rates and fees could be sky high. In some cities, they were $4,000 or even more per year for a single small cell. We knew that was going to be a huge problem when we started rolling out large numbers of small cells for 5G. So if we can move to the next slide, please. It's really the last slide I'll be speaking to. So it became clear pretty quickly that a legislative solution was necessary to clear the way for small cell deployment and for 5G. In 2016, the first small cell bills were introduced and passed in Kansas and Ohio. Since then, 27 more states and Puerto Rico have adopted small cell statutes. So we now have 29 state small cell statutes and the Puerto Rico statute on the books. Most of the statutes address certain core issues: access to the right-of-way and government poles, a streamlined application process, and reasonable rates and fees. But there has been a good bit of variation on how those and other issues have been resolved. That's because the bills have been heavily negotiated and priorities of municipal and other stakeholders have been markedly different from state to state. But along the way, we've learned a lot and have gotten pretty good at addressing concerns that have been raised by state and local governments. There we go. While the state legislatures were busy working on small cell bills, the FCC was also focusing on how to remove barriers to 5G deployment. The FCC has authority in that area because federal law imposes certain requirements on state and local governments when it comes to the use of the right-of-way for telecommunications facilities. Among other things, state and local requirements can't prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the ability of any entity from providing telecommunications service. The FCC issued an order in 2018 that established outside limits on what state and local governments can do when it comes to rates and fees, aesthetics, and application deadlines known as shot clocks. For example, recurring charges are presumptively valid if the combined rates for access to the right-of-way and for attaching to a government pole do not exceed $270 per year. And the maximum shot clocks are set at 60 days for the co-location of a small cell on an existing pole and 90 days for the installation of a new pole and small cell. At the time the FCC order was issued, 20 states had adopted small cell statutes, and the FCC relied on those statutes when adopting its parameters. And obviously the drafters of the statutes that have been adopted since the order was issued have had the benefit of the FCC's requirements. The FCC's order was upheld in almost all respects by the Ninth Circuit just last month. So one question you might have is whether state small cell statutes are still necessary now that the FCC order has been affirmed. The answer is yes. For openers, although the FCC's order is extremely helpful, state statutes create more detailed rules of the road and resolve issues not addressed by the order. Maybe even more importantly, state statutes are making a big difference in where small cells are actually deployed, and they give states that have adopted them a competitive advantage. I mean, simply put, capital flows where it is welcomed. And all things considered, we're seeing more deployment in states that have small cell statutes than states that don't. Well, why is that? Probably a number of reasons. I'll give you three. First, there are detailed rules of engagement that guide everyone involved. City officials, city staffers processing applications, the folks with the telecom companies that are submitting the applications, that are actually doing the physical deployment. Everybody knows in detail what's expected. And second thing, as the bills have gone through the legislative process, state and local governments were at the table and helped work out how deployment was going to happen in their states. And third thing I'd point out is that most state statutes have hard caps on rates and fees. So providers know what their costs are going to be, which helps them develop their business plans. We definitely see a need for small cell bills in New Jersey and New York. There are a lot of cities in both states where it's taken us a long time to obtain access to deploy small cells, and many where we still don't have access. Buffalo, New York is a good example. We've been trying to negotiate reasonable access terms there for more than 2 years without success. As a result, the city is missing out on significant investments in wireless broadband. Trenton, New Jersey is another example. There, the city granted AT&T and Verizon access just a few days ago after several months of delay based on unfounded concerns that 5G was somehow linked to the coronavirus. All right, let's talk for just a couple of minutes about the New Jersey and New York small cell bills that have been proposed. The New Jersey bill was introduced in the Assembly and Senate this year and is now pending in committee in both chambers. Industry and the State League of Municipalities have been in negotiations for several months on the bill and have narrowed their differences to a small number of issues. We hope to conclude those negotiations soon. In New York, small cell legislation was proposed in the governor's budgets in 2018 and 2020, but each time it was stricken after trade associations representing local governments opposed it. We have since had discussions with the Association of Towns and the Conference of Mayors, but negotiations are still in the early stages. So the New Jersey and New York bills would build on work that's been done in other states and would address the key issues. The bills differ in some respects, but have a lot in common concerning how they deal with the issues. So I'll touch on some of the important ones. Access. The bills provide access to the right-of-way in government poles. So providers would not need to negotiate a franchise or license agreement before they can apply to deploy small cells. And providers could co-locate small cells on existing structures in the right-of-way and deploy their own poles to support small cells. In the New Jersey bill in particular, providers are required to determine whether it's possible to co-locate on an existing structure before applying to deploy a new pole. For the bills in both states, for government poles, the bill set up a make-ready process for work necessary to ensure the pole can support the requested co-location. Okay, next issue, process. The bills establish a streamlined administrative application process for small cells and support poles. Applicants would not have to go through a zoning process to have an application approved. The bills specify what can be required in a small cell application and set out the criteria to be used when evaluating an application. They also limit the time within which the government authority must act, establishing shot clocks. Applications are deemed approved if not acted upon within the required time. Rates and fees. The bill set caps on one-time application fees and on recurring rates for access to the right-of-way and government poles. These are hard caps that would help prevent disputes down the road about what the fees and rates should be. In both bills, the rates and fees are set equal to the FCC's presumptively valid amounts. Right-of-way protection. The bills include a number of provisions that enable government authorities to protect the right-of-way. For example, both bills limit the height of new poles, normally to 50 feet. They authorize the adoption of aesthetic requirements, provided they meet certain criteria, such as being reasonable and technically feasible. The bills have special provisions for underground areas and historic districts. Those provisions balance facilitating deployment and protecting these more sensitive areas. And the bills require providers to repair damage to the right-of-way and remove abandoned facilities. So the bottom line is these are good bills. They build on a lot of work that's been done in other states, and they would do a lot to accelerate the deployment of small cells and 5G in New Jersey and New York. So with that, Arturo, I will pass it on to you.
Well, thank you, Dee, and okay, thank you. Good morning, Arturo Chang with WIA. We hope you are all doing well during this trying times, and thank you for joining this morning. Before I get started, just wanted to give a short overview about the Wireless Infrastructure Association. Next slide, please. We are we represent the companies that own, design, operate, and build infrastructure, wireless infrastructure in the country. Our members are the infrastructure companies, the wireless carriers, and the plethora of ecosystem that makes up the wireless industry, such as fiber companies, law firms, and consultant services. If you like to touch base, feel free to do so. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the benefits of 5G. And in other words, why should you care about having connectivity and wireless in your cities, in your states? And the first one is, for us, it's going to be workforce. Next slide, please. So as Beth and Dee noted, workforce is a major part of what wireless connectivity and investment brings. In this trying times, one of the things that I think many of you can relate to is that we've been as busy as ever. We have not stopped working, deploying, and providing that connectivity. And if anything, wireless networks are really on demand right now because of remote learning, working from home, and many other areas of where you need service. And I'll touch a little bit more about that later. But when it comes to workforce, yes. The wireless industry supports and creates jobs. These are well-paying jobs. Many of them do not require a college degree, whether you are installing towers or small cells. There's a tremendous need for an educated and well-trained workforce to meet this demand. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight a couple of efforts by WIA on this important item. The first one is TIRAP. The Wireless Infrastructure Association is the national sponsor of TIRAP. You can find more information there. And this is related to apprenticeship, an important area to fulfill and accommodate for workforce development purposes. Also wanted to know that Warriors for Wireless, which is a nonprofit exclusively designed for industry professionals transitioning for the military. I also wanted to touch base on a couple of the workforce aspects not noted here, but one of them is e-commerce, right? My wife, for example, has a small business that largely depends on e-commerce, and what we're seeing in these times is a lot of businesses going online. How can they reach their base? How can they reach consumers? And certainly, wireless connectivity plays a major role in that particular item. Next slide, please. Telehealth, again, one of the growing industries in this remote times is telehealth. So I know Beth noted the many doctor appointments that she's had to do virtually, myself as well. But we've seen an exponential increase of health offices transitioning into remote appointments for their patients if it's nothing urgent. This largely depends and relies on connectivity, right? So we have the FCC working on this issue. We have the states working on this issue. And one of the things that we have seen that we have experienced in the past months is those communities that lack wireless connectivity or simply just don't have the infrastructure to meet the demand are really feeling the pinch of this issue. Customers are demanding more networks, more capacity, more densification for all these services. I think it's important that we all take a step back and think about what else wireless connectivity brings. Next slide, please. Education and distance learning, obviously the trend of COVID-19 for many of you that have children or that have kids in college is it's a challenging time, right? We have many schools across the country, across the nation that have required a hybrid of distance learning or have gone exclusively into distance learning. This creates a high demand for wireless connectivity at home where, if you have if you have many children, then you have to have a connectivity that can support 2 or 3 more computers online. We have seen millions of students at all levels going to distance learning, and yet we have seen 14.1% of school-age children that have no wired broadband connection at home. In some of the cities near me, I've seen school buses being parked around to provide wireless connectivity. And in fact, even before COVID hit the US and the world, I had legislators from all political sides, from all states, from many states, just coming up to us, coming to the industry and asking us, what can I do to bring connectivity to my city? My children, our young generation are leaving the city and not coming back because they have no connectivity. Or my children, my students have to go to a Starbucks or a McDonald's to do homework. We've really seen how the young generation is transitioning into relying on wireless connectivity, and now more than ever, with education and distance learning, it is pivotal that we really work towards ways collaboratively to deploy and meet that demand, because if anything, that demand is going to only increase as we go forward. Next slide, please. And the economy. I know Beth touched a little bit on this, but again, the wireless industry is a major driver of innovation, and it's one of those things that we see as so tangible. I know a lot of the times we always want to know what advanced wireless networks, including 5G, what is that going to bring to us? What make it tangible to me. But one of the things that is interesting and what excites me is that we actually don't know. If you were to tell me 10 years ago that 3G and 4G in these devices will give us the ability to call a taxi cab or have food delivered here, or that we would be relying solely on these devices for telehealth or GPS directions, you would have perhaps sounded a little bit crazy on that. And the thing is that 5G has so much more to bring, and it's going to create the pathway for these new innovative applications to come to fruition. We can certainly predict some of them. We talked about telehealth, we talked about smart cards, smart cities, but the fact is 5G is going to bring a lot more. And I think, and hopefully you are as excited as I am to understand that 5G will provide that foundation for all those systems, for all those applications to occur. That is my portion. I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, thank you all for your time. And that's back to Adrian, I believe. Aaron, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Arturo. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Dee, for your great presentation so far. Before we go on, I'd like to once again thank our sponsors. On behalf of New York State Wireless, I definitely would like to once again thank Amato Law Group. Dominic, I think you will once again thank New Jersey's ongoing sponsors. We will be sending out an email follow-up with information on what you can do to assist with both the New York and New Jersey bill efforts. We definitely need your help. And now we will be going directly into some of the questions. The questions are still open. I urge everyone to please use the Q&A button on the bottom. We have a number and we will be going through them in the order that we receive them. So the first is from James. Why do the carriers and their lobbyists, CTIA and WIA, feel that they should be attempting to influence state representatives to pass legislation that strips the authority from local officials who are directly elected by their community to represent their direct interests in that community? Arturo, would you like to start with this? Or Beth or Dee?
I can start. I mean, I think this goes back to my previous point. Starting with the premise, if we start with the premise that small cells are different than macros, which they are, then the answer is there needs to be a different process. And one of the issues right now is a lot of the current processes in place have not caught up to technology. So then the question is, how do we reform that? The FCC certainly has made some steps there, and we can talk about that later. But the FCC provided a bare framework of the deployment. And then we take that framework and we tailor it to New York. We tailor it to New Jersey. Let's do things in New York and the New Jersey way, right? The FCC could not touch on many specific state elements that we have, that each state has. But let me take it a step further. We have 29 states with a small cell bill, Puerto Rico as well. We've been deploying under those bills for 2 to 3 years. And so the fact is, the industry works very closely with communities across the country to deploy in a way that makes sense. We are part of your communities, and what we're trying to do is try to meet that demand. So it's not so much about a zero-sum game, because that's really not the case. The fact is, we want to meet that demand. We want to provide pathways to economic growth. We want to provide a pathways for students to go to school and come back to their communities and start businesses, to entrepreneurship. It's a variety of elements that we're trying to bring. And I can tell you, in many states, counties and cities have supported our efforts. And let me just make one more point. One of the things that sometimes we get as the industry is there is no process for a small cell framework, right? So a lot of communities and cities get an application for a small cell, and they simply don't have in their books, they don't have a framework of how to process an application. They don't know what factors to consider. And if anything, and we've heard positive and really good news in many states where cities will come and say, this small cell bill gives me a framework to understand what I can consider, how should I process it, how often, how long do I have? So it's really about working together and not so much about the industry trying to push. The fact is, there's a demand. We're trying to meet that demand. We're trying to modernize the processes that work, and it's been working well across the country and many other states. And so, I don't want to make the impression that New York or New Jersey are first case impressions, because they're not. We've been deploying for many years, and what we're trying to do is, I think to this point is, innovation and investment will come in places that avail themselves to it. And so right now, New York and New Jersey are actually competing with many states around the country that have standardized their system, that have provided a predictable pathways for applications, and you're competing with that directly. And so we want to make sure that New Jersey and New York avail themselves to it. And I'll make one last point. I've testified in many committees around the country, and in one particular case, we had a member of the industry, and I'm not going to say who they were, but they told legislators explicitly that they are so busy investing in states where there is a pathway and a process and a predictable framework. They're so busy investing in those states that they almost have very little time to come to states where there isn't a process. And so that's a direct example of when we're looking at deploying and meeting that demand, where is the industry going to? And obviously places that open themselves to the process will get it quicker. So again, sorry for going on along there, but I thought it was important to address that point.
Thank you. And we'll move on to Dominic for the next question.
Thank you, Adrian. I'd like to thank our panelists as well, Beth and Dee and Arturo, for the great job that you've done presenting. And also, again, thanks to all of our New Jersey Wireless sponsors. Without your support, we would not be able to put on these types of educational programs. We got a lot of great questions here. I'm going to go to the next question, as Adrian said, in line. There was it's an anonymous question that was put forth. A town in Connecticut apparently has done a moratorium. Dee, you had mentioned a little bit about moratoriums, and in towns there was a concern about, I guess, the health effects and if it's safe for the humans and environment. And they have a 5G cease and desist resolution in this town in Connecticut. And I guess the question is, one, were we aware of it? I myself was not aware of it, but the one thing I'd like to say, and then I would, I think, Beth, I can turn it over. Maybe you can answer some of these questions. We had mentioned in the beginning of this webinar that we had an RF safety, or radio frequency safety webinar. That was our previous one. And on that one, we had Dr. Ken Foster from the University of Pennsylvania. And it explained a lot of the information, and I'd like to think that he allayed a lot of the fears that there were about 5G and concerns about emissions. So I would suggest that you check our websites and you look at some of that information to get some more information. about 5G and the concerns about the effects of 5G. But with that, I'll turn it over to Beth, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the carriers that you represent and some of the things that you've heard and seen about the 5G concerns with respect to this.
Sure. Thank you, Dominic. As for Easton, Connecticut, we became aware of it is a non-binding resolution, so it does not have the effect of law. So there is no moratorium, so to speak, but it is still an educational opportunity for the industry to have these conversations about what are the benefits of 5G? Why are we doing this? As Arturo said, densifying our networks for the demands today, but to get ready for 5G. So it's an ongoing conversation, but I would note it as a non-binding resolution that does not have the force of law. However, on the 5G RF concerns, I think many on this webinar in the audience know that under the Telecom Act in Section 332, there is language that says that no state or local government may regulate the placement, construction, and modification of personal wireless facilities on the basis of environmental effects of RF. The FCC also, who regulates exclusively in this area, in December 2019, unanimously reaffirmed that its existing limits for RF exposure. They, quote, said, after reviewing the extensive records submitted in response to the inquiry, we find no appropriate basis for and thus decline to propose amendments to our existing limits at this time. And that was in December last year. And then finally, if you look at the consensus among health experts, including the American Cancer Society, the World Health Organization, the US Food and Drug Administration, the weight of scientific evidence shows no known adverse health effects to humans from exposures to wireless antennas or devices. In terms of other resources, Dominic, I know you all have resources. We do as well at wirelesshealthfacts.com. Again, that is information from those expert agencies compiled there and is a great resource to dispel some of the misinformation that's being spread around. So thank you.
Thanks, Beth. With that, I'll turn it back over to Adrian for the next question.
Thank you. And one more thing in regards to that specific question on health effects and related. We did have a session recently, also jointly with New Jersey Wireless, where we had a well-regarded expert in RF, Ken Foster, speaking on many of these issues, and that is up on our websites if anyone would like to take a look at that webinar. It's very informative, and it was very well attended as well. So on to the next question from Adam Bender. What is the status of New York's Public Service Commission poll attachments proceeding that responded to a CTIA petition from 2016?
Hey, Adam, thanks for the question. I will need to check in with my state regulatory team. I'm on the legislative side, so I can check in with them and get back to you.
Thank you. And since Adam has another question, I will go right to that. How do the pandemic and legislative calendars affect the likely timing of getting votes on small cell bills in both New York and New Jersey? Beth, Arturo, Dee, anyone want to take lead on this?
Arturo, I don't know if you have any insight. From my end, COVID has changed everything in state legislative sessions. I know New Jersey's was focused on their budget, and so that was a priority. I would need to check if they passed it. I apologize, I should know that. But Arturo or Dee, I don't know if you guys have any insight. I do not. COVID in the majority of states has thrown a loop for schedules and calendars.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I agree. I think COVID has greatly affected every state and legislature sessions as well. I mean, we're looking at how we're looking at how to move the bills forward. We're not committed to this session, or if it doesn't happen, then we'll work on the next year. Right now, we're still working with our partners and with communities to reach a good point and go from there. But we don't have a set schedule in terms of the legislative calendar.
Okay.
Thank you. Dominic, would you like to take on the next question?
I will. Thank you, Adrian. The next question, a good question about the Ninth Circuit Court ruling. Will it play an important role in getting challenging municipalities such as Buffalo to cooperate or collaborate? And will the industry associations be taking a collective approach to emphasize or advocate on this ruling? I'd like to throw this to talk a little bit about the Ninth Circuit ruling, maybe to Dee first, and then perhaps Beth and Arturo, representing the industry associations, could weigh in as well.
Sure, I'll start on that. The Ninth Circuit ruling was really helpful. It upheld the FCC order, as I mentioned, in almost all respects. I think the most hotly disputed issue was the FCC's determination that rates and fees should be cost-based, and then the FCC went on to create presumptively valid rate and fee levels that could be exceeded if a city could show that a higher level was based on cost, but essentially created a safe harbor if you were within, for example, $270 for the combined right-of-way access and government pole access rates. So then when we move to that, I'm not sure what the associations may be contemplating. Certainly a helpful ruling. I think there have been cities that were really waiting to see how this was going to come out. So hopefully this is going to lead to some progress. How it'll play out in Buffalo or any particular city, I think remains to be seen. Beth and Arturo, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dee. We have not had conversations specific to Buffalo internally, but we are always concerned when cities have perhaps higher fees that will deter investment, and something that we'll be watching, because as Dee said, capital flows to the path of least resistance. And again, we're trying to keep our customers happy, who are many constituents for folks who are watching. And so we're watching, and no comment beyond that at this time, though.
Yeah, same. I think we're all still analyzing ways forward on this decision.
Thank you. The next question is from Joshua. It seems that the only push by the wireless providers is in large metropolitan areas. However, like it was said, we are seeing millions without broadband, but there's no attempt to really connect to rural areas. When will we see real deployment in rural areas? Great question. Arturo, do you want to take point on that, or?
Yeah, and I'll hand it over to Beth. I know she has some things to say too. So I think first and foremost, there's no denying one of the primary goals of the industry right now is to meet the demand, to densify the networks and provide the service that the customers need. Certainly, this is going to be the more densely populated area, so no question there. That's one of the goals. When it comes to rural and rural broadband and places that lack connectivity, I can tell you there's no silver bullet. So this is every state has this issue. It is a matter that the FCC and every state legislature is taking a look at. When we talk about rural, I know all of us hear about rural, but rural means different things to different people. Rural New York looks a lot different than rural Nebraska. So one of the things that I talk about when it comes to this issue is, let's talk about what can we do to determine the likelihood of broadband getting there. We're talking about mapping. Do you have utilities? Do you have fiber underneath? All those elements are important to provide connectivity to rural areas and broadband. It is an effort that all of us are working towards. But there's certainly no denying that one of the primary purposes is to meet the densification of densely populated areas for the moment. One of the things that also would happen is, freeing up and regulatory barriers will continue to allow the wireless industry to deploy in those areas. So obviously, again, it's a multifaceted effort, and there really is no simple answer to the rural solution.
Yeah, Arturo, you took the words out of my mouth. No silver bullet, a regulatory framework with as much certainty. Yes, we're going where our customers are. So whether that is a metropolitan area, a suburban, exurban, or rural, whether you have a main street with a densification of people who are using data-rich applications, we're going where the network needs are. We're without, regard to whether it's a metropolitan area or suburban or rural. But Arturo hit it on the head.
Yeah, this is Dee. I agree with that. And one thing that you have to remember that when we're talking about millimeter wave deployment with small cells, the reach or the coverage is pretty limited, maybe up to 1,000 feet or something like that, depending on the exact technology being used. It's a really great technology for dense areas, football stadium, an arena, downtown crossroads, and a lot of other places where there's a lot of data traffic. But it doesn't do a lot of good in an area that's not densely populated because, again, of the limited reach. So I agree with Beth and Arturo.
All right, Adrian, I'll take that next question. There was a question that Arturo had answered previously. I think what I'll do is I'll throw this over to Dee from a carrier's perspective. The question really is about this legislation, the proposed legislation, and what happens with towns. And there was a concern about towns losing some of their ability to regulate what's going on. Now, Dee, you had mentioned in your presentation about aesthetics and some of the other things that are incorporated in these laws that are proposed. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit and I think answer this question.
Sure. So maybe a couple of points to make. One is that bear in mind in the legislative process itself that the cities and towns are represented. And one of the things that has really helped the small cell statutes be effective is that the cities have a big say in how this plays out. But the second thing, and I think this is where you're going, is the statutes give cities a lot of authority. I mean, for example, they allow cities to adopt aesthetic requirements. I mean, they've got to be reasonable, subject to certain limitations, but cities can sit down and figure out if there's some part of town where they've got a certain look that they want and that everybody is required to comply with, then they can require the small cells to fit in. The statutes deal with historic districts, underground areas, and also give cities the ability. I mean, it's not like an application is automatically approved. There are a number of criteria that cities can consider to make sure that they are preserving the safety and the look of their right-of-way. So cities have a big say in what the statutes look like, and within the statutes, cities get a big say in how deployments happen in their cities. So it's a balancing exercise because the states know the deployment needs to happen. Cities have a lot to say about how it happens. That's how I'd summarize it.
Yeah, and if I could chime in, because it sounds like the questioner is looking for specifics. And so I just want to give a few examples of how a small cell application can be denied. So, cities retain their permitting review authority, So a city can deny a permit if the application doesn't meet uniform building, fire, electrical, plumbing, mechanical codes, if it interferes with the safe operation of traffic control equipment or sight lines for air, land, or pedestrian travel, if it interferes with compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, there are, as Dee outlined, this is not just carte blanche. The city has a lot of authority if an application doesn't meet those needs for a city, it would be denied. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Dee. Thanks, Beth. We're coming up here on the top of the hour. Adrian, it seems like we've got some follow through on some of the other questions, but it looks like maybe the last one we take here is the pitch from David about New Yorkers for 5G.
Sure, I'll take that. Thank you to David, who is one of NYSWA's board members. He wanted to remind us to make a pitch for a newly formed group, which is the New Yorkers for 5G. It was formed primarily to educate residents and businesses and lawmakers about the efforts to deliver fast online access and all the issues, or many of the issues that we've been discussing today. If you are interested in additional information, please reach out to NYSWA and we will provide you the contacts there very quickly. And Dominic, do you want to try one more question since we have a couple more minutes?
Sure. Well, let's see what we have here. Yeah, next question is, when carriers claim to have 5G networks blanketing states and territories, when there in fact is no public right-of-way 5G deployments, what are these claims based on?
I can take that.
Go ahead,
if you
Beth.
want, Dominic. So as I tried to level set in sort of how these networks work, and yes, we're talking about small cells and millimeter wave that perhaps doesn't go as far, but some wireless providers are deploying 5G on their macro towers, on outside the right of way, on different licensed spectrum. So when we talk about coverage, we're talking different licensed spectrum, different infrastructure being used. So both within and within and outside the right of way.
I think that's a good point. Actually, from what I've seen, all the carriers are deploying this on their macro cells as well. So while there's certainly an emphasis and a focus on these small cells in the right of way, many of the macro sites that are out there, the towers, the rooftops, the other sites that you had shown in your slides, actually have 5G installed in them or is being installed. And 5G is different. There's different rollouts from the different carriers, but the fact of the matter is that they're all rolling it out slightly different ways. They have slightly different strategies on how to do this, but it's getting out there fast on all of these sites as well. So,
to one final point, I think many of you have been are familiar with the Gs, right? The 1G, 2G, 3G, 4 generation, and I heard this said one time, but it's really true. Is 5G is going to be the hardest G to get to, and it's going to take every one of us and every type of infrastructure, both macro, small cell, and everything in between to get there. I think that's very true because of the technology itself, and we look forward to working with all of you on this important economic issue.
Thank you, Arturo. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We've had a pretty good response. We had a lot of great questions, a lot of good questions from various of our participants. Hopefully that this will generate some good interest. And as we said before, we have our this information. There'll be follow-up information. There'll be information available on both NYSWA and New Jersey Wireless websites, so please keep posted. Check those websites for that information. Finally, I'd like to talk about the upcoming events. We've got New Jersey Wireless Association. We're going to have an Oktoberfest networking social event. We're targeting for the end of October of this year. So keep your ear to the ground on that, and we will send those details out shortly. And NYSWA is also planning their Oktoberfest networking social in October as well. We've coordinated dates because we know we have a lot of overlapping members in our two organizations, and our members attend all of our events, both NYSWA and New Jersey Wireless. So we'll continue to do that so that everyone can do that. But look forward to that information coming out as well. And we we look forward to seeing everyone at those upcoming events.
Thank you.